All right, welcome back to the Getting Started webinar series. We will be doing the third installment of Getting Started with Mapbox GL.js. So we have a couple people watching today, so if you have anything to ask, you can go ahead and use the chat, which I'll keep up and try and monitor. And we'll also have some Q&A time at the end if you want to wait till then. And let's jump right in. So if you're not already familiar with Mapbox, go check out our website. We have a great overview of the different customers that use our products and the different suite of tools we offer. But it's a lot more than just maps. We have a lot of location-based services, APIs, and data that'll help you when you're building on iOS, Android, or on mobile, or on the web. So go take a look. I'm Chris. You probably met me before if you're on episode 3 now of this Getting Started with Mapbox GL. So you can find me on Twitter very easily. You can also jump into our developer Discord and say hello, but happy to be here talking to you today. Okay, this slide should say part 3, but it says part 2. So today what we're going to cover is controlling the map. So we're going to cover how to flyTo and fitBounds. We're going to highlight a layer on hover. So when the user's moving their mouse around, you want to maybe show them that they can click on something by changing the style a little bit. So we'll look at that. We're going to show how to show and hide layers. So we'll just wire up some very simple buttons into our little test app and be able to show and hide a layer on demand. We're going to add an address search plugin. So like I showed in the previous couple of slides, Mapbox has a very robust search API, but you can use that with just a few lines of code by adding a JavaScript package, and it's pretty easy to set up. So I'll show that today. And then finally, we'll take a look at Mapbox Studio. Mapbox Studio is kind of like Figma for maps or Photoshop for maps, however you want to describe it, but gives you a great user interface for styling and also gives you a lot more control over what we would call the base map or what we might consider the base map. So that's what we'll cover today. So I'm going to jump right in. And if you recall, we had a nice little project here called First Map, which I set up in the last couple episodes. I'm going to drag that right into Visual Studio Code. And like I said, we've just got one HTML file and then a data file with our NYC boroughs in it, and I'll click go live and we can see what our map looks like. So this is where we left off on the last episode. We've got some polygons in here for the boroughs of New York City. We have some markers from the first episode. All these things have different colors on them. And then I think if you click on one of these polygons, we get a nice little alert and it pulls some data out of the properties from the GeoJSON layer that we loaded. So without further ado, let's keep moving. And first thing I want to cover is we're going to add, we're going to do some flying to and some fitting of bounds. So first thing I want to do is very quickly set up a little sidebar. So let's go into the code here, and if we remember, we have a nice div with an ID of map on it, and that is basically styled to take up the full screen. So what I'm going to do very quickly is just add a little sidebar so we have a place to put our buttons. So we'll say div ID equals sidebar. Oops, sidebar. And let's close that div. And let's put all of these into a container. So we'll say div ID equals container. Quotes keep messing me up. So let's finish that up. All right, so I'm going to move this closing div and make sure my sidebar and my container are both in, my sidebar and my map container are both inside of the container div. Next, let's add some styling. So let's say container, I'm going to do a flex layout. So let's do display : flex. And let's make sure that map has flex shrink, flex grow 1, and let's add sidebar down here, sidebar, and let's make that flex grow, flex shrink 0, and let's give it a width. So we'll do a 300 pixel sidebar. And I believe we also need heights for all these because let's see, make the container have full height. Let's make map have full height. Let's make map no longer position absolute, so we can get rid of top and bottom. And let's save this and see what I forgot to do. Actually, before I even save it, I forgot to put height 100% on the body. Let's see if that gets us a sidebar. Nope. Okay, let's see what happened there. So container has no height. Height 100%. Container is a child of body. And body also has a height of 100%. HTML does not have height. So let's do the HTML. Okay, there we go. So we have a nice little sidebar here that I can start putting some buttons in. So the first thing I want to show is that we can use flyTo. And flyTo is basically a command where you can pass in things like a center point, a zoom level, and the map will smoothly animate to that view. So right now, the user can control the view and we can zoom in and out. I showed you before, you can hold down control if you're on a Mac and you can change the pitch and rotation. So we have a lot of control over this camera. But most of the time people are just dragging and zooming, so panning the map and zooming, but we can have programmatic control of the map using flyTo. So I want to bring up the docs for flyTo. Let's do Mapbox GL flyTo. So there's a great example here, fly to a location, that actually will show you how to do it and has like a live example. We can start with that, but what I really want to show you is if we follow this first link where it says use flyTo, we can see the docs, and that's what I wanted to share. So flyTo is a method on map, so we can say map.flyTo. Then we pass in options, and then also we can pass in event data. So the options are what we're most interested down here. So options object is an object describing the destination and animation of the transition, accepts camera options and animation options and the following additional options. So to understand that, we actually need to click on this link for camera options, and it'll show the kinds of things we can pass in, but we can also pass in these other options. So camera options is probably the most useful ones we can pass in. And the properties on camera options are around, bearing, center, padding, and pitch, and zoom. So we're going to start with center and zoom. But first, let's get ourselves a button. So inside of sidebar, I'm going to add a button tag. And we'll just say fly to Coney Island. So I'm going to give this button an ID so that I can select it, or so I can listen to a click on it. So let's do ID equals fly-to-Coney. Let's save that and go back and take a quick look. So we have a nice button here. It says fly to Coney Island. Let's go back here and give our sidebar some padding of 30 pixels so that this button has a little breathing room. There it goes. So if I click this button, nothing happens right now. So let's now wire up a JavaScript event listener. So I'm going to scroll all the way down in my code here. I guess we could do it inside of, we don't really have to do it. We don't have to really wait for the map to load, I think, to do this. I guess we run the risk of somebody clicking it before the map is loaded, but it happens very quickly. So maybe we can deal with that later if we have to. So let's just go right down to the bottom of the code, and I'll say, sorry, not map. Let's add an event listener. So we're going to say document.query selector, and in quotes, we're going to name the ID of our selector, which was fly to Coney, I think. And then we're going to say .add event listener. And the event we want to listen for is a click. So let's do click. And let's do an arrow function. Oops. And then in here, first thing I like to do when I set up my event listeners usually is just console log something to make sure that they're actually listening for the correct event. So let's just say click. And we'll go back to our project and make this a little bigger for you. And let's open up the developer tools. So if I click this button, I get a nice little console log down here. It says click. Let's move that over because I think it gets cut off in Zoom. So there's our click. So it's not doing anything to the map yet, but at least we know the listener is working. So now on to the fun stuff. So we can say map.fitBounds. Sorry, not fitBounds. We're going to do flyTo first. and pass in an empty, well, here's an empty object, but we can do things like center and zoom. And next thing we need, so center is just the same way we had the map center when we instantiated the map. We need an array of, let's do a zoom level 18 here. No, let's do 15. Okay, so we need an array, a longitude and latitude array that we can pass in for the new center. So I will go to my old friend, bboxfinder.com, and we're going to zoom in on Coney Island, New York, and see if we can get a latitude and longitude for a good center point to zoom to. That's not Coney Island. Here we go. So here's our baseball stadium over here, and here's the boardwalk. So we're just going to go right onto the boardwalk. So let me copy this latitude and longitude, longitude and latitude, and paste it right in. So I'm going to get rid of this console log, but this code right here is all we need to add a event listener with vanilla JavaScript. If you're using jQuery, you can do it with a little less code. If you're using React or something else, it's all the same mechanics, but you just need to kind of fit this into however you're listening for events in the browser. So let's save that and then go click our button for the first time. So fly to Coney Island. Look at that. Okay, so we have a giant polygon that's orange covering everything up, so there's not much to see here, but you get the idea. So the next thing I want is a reset button that'll take me back to the original view. So I'm actually going to copy this entire chunk of code down here for this event listener. Let's add a little comment here. It says fly to Coney Island. And then I'll add another comment down here that says, what should it say? Reset the map view. So to reset the map view, I just want to go back to where we started. But instead of hard coding those values, I'm going to use some variables here that don't exist yet. So I'm going to say initial underscore center, and I'll say initial underscore zoom. And now I need to make sure that these variables exist. So let's go back up to where we originally set up the map. So here our initial zoom was 11, and this is our center point. So I'm actually going to pull these values out so I can use them in two places. So let's call that initial center. And right at the very top of my script tag here, I'm going to say const initial center equals those coordinates. So that was like the middle of New York. We'll do the same thing for const initial zoom equals, not an array. Let's do, actually, I think 11 is maybe too far zoomed in for this. So let's maybe do 9 and change this back to initial zoom. Okay, so now I've got a zoom and a center point and a zoom level for the initial view, and I want to just make sure that that works. So next thing I need is another button. So let's go up to our HTML and add another button that just says, so we'll give an ID on this button, which is called reset dash view, and we'll say reset. So let's save that. And there's our reset button. Just for the heck of it, let's add some more styling up here and say, this should be, if we display these as blocks, they'll have some space between them and they'll go into new lines. So let's do display block. All right, and let's give them also some margin bottom of 15 pixels, just so they're not so crowded. Okay, beautiful. So we've got a reset button, but when I click it, it does nothing. When I click fly to Coney Island, that one also does nothing. I'm not sure why. So let's figure out what's going on. So let's go back down here to our event listeners. Fly to Coney Island. Why aren't you working? Okay, so we said map.flyTo, and then we said reset the map view. Okay, so reset the map view, we should be listening for the ID, the div that has the ID, click on an ID that has reset dash view. Let's see if that works. Something has gone wrong. Give me just a moment here and let's figure out what happened. I wonder if it was the styling of my buttons that did it. Oh, I see why. is because I had two event listeners that were listening for the same click, and the second one superseded the first one. So when we clicked on reset, it was actually setting, clicking on fly to Coney Island was actually flying to the initial view, which is where we already started. So let's save this and we should be working now. Fly to Coney Island works. And now if I hit reset, oops, we have an error. Let's see what we see down here in the console. Cannot read properties of null. Okay, so it's saying it doesn't can't find query selector reset dash view, and let's make sure that the ID is correct. So let's scroll back up here. Okay, and of course I added an extra Y, so should be reset view. This should work now. Okay, fly to Coney Island, great. Reset, we fly back. Okay, so that's basically how flyTo works, but we can also add some other things, like say we wanted to do a pitch. We could say pitch should be like 45, and that's 45 degrees, so it's going to kind of turn the camera this way. And when we go back to reset view, let's make sure we set that back to 0. Pitch 0. Let's try them now. So fly to Coney Island. And it's very subtle, but we did pitch a little bit, and you can actually see that we're kind of looking at an angle now. And if we reset, we'll go back. Okay, very fun. Let's add another button, and I'll show you what fitBounds does. So flyTo, gives you a position to fly to, but it's not really concerned about keeping. You may want to actually make sure that you don't care where the camera goes. You just want it to have one feature fully in view. So a good way to do that is with fitBounds, which will actually make sure that the camera just moves to a position that fits something on the ground, whether it be a large polygon or just a bounding box that you already know or care about for something. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to zoom to one borough of New York, and we're going to manually enter a bounding box for that area that we wanted to fitBounds to. So first, let's make a button. So I have reset here, so I'm going to leave a line there, and let's add another button that says, instead of flyTo, we're going to say fit to Queens. And let's give that an ID. So we'll call it fit-to-Queens. And somehow I keep getting these Y's in here. Okay, so fit to Queens exists, doesn't do anything. Let's go add another event listener. So I'm scrolling all the way back down here and copy and paste my listener. Let's add a comment that here says fit to Queens. And let's make sure we're listening to the correct ID or the correct correct element. So let's do fit to Queens will be what we want to select to listen to a click. And then instead of flyTo, we're going to say fitBounds. All right, so let's go take a look at the docs for fitBounds. So I'm back here in the docs. Let's go to fitBounds. So again, we have an example here. So you can actually check out this example. It's pretty great. If you click fit to Kenya, it'll do the same sort of thing where it will animate the camera. But let's go take a look at the docs for fitBounds themselves. And we can see for this method, we pass in bounds. So bounds is a long lat bounds like, which is, there's a few different ways you can represent bounds. But the simplest way is with an array that contains two arrays, one for the southwest corner and one for the northeast corner. So you can check out the rest of these options because you can actually control the easing and whether it's linear and those sorts of things. You can also set padding so that instead of fitting directly to the boundary, it can add a certain distance in pixels. So there's lots more you can do with it. But for basics, let's actually take a look at this code because it's really easy to talk through. So just like we have in our code, we have a click event listener here. But all they're doing here is when they call fitBounds, they pass in an array with two sets of coordinates, one for the southwest corner and one for the northeast corner. So I'm literally just going to copy this code. Let's go back to my project here and let's clean this up a little bit. Okay, so southwestern corner and northeastern corner. So I just need to go get coordinates again. I'm going to go back to bboxfinder.com and I'm just going to roughly eyeball, southwestern corner of Queens to be something like, it's actually quite in Brooklyn because Queens is so big. So let's just do that as our southwestern corner. And I'll copy the coordinates. And for the northeastern corner, let's go way up here. I think that'll capture all of it, but we're just roughing it for now. You can always modify this later. So let's copy that and paste it. And when we save that and go back to our project, let's see if Fit to Queens works. Okay, so I probably didn't go far enough east, but that's all right. We can fix it later. So I can now click to Fit to Queens. I can click Fly to Coney Island, and I can click Reset. So you get the idea here, but you can imagine, if you had, if you're showing property listings or something like that, you could have a list of those properties over on one side, and if you click on it, it'll take the map there. A lot of times when people set up complex applications, they have a list view, but they want the map to, they don't want to load a different map for each item in the list. So they'll have one map. And then when you hover over the list or click on something on the list, you can always control the map to make sure it reflects whatever's selected. So you have a lot of good control over this, and the animations can actually make it really compelling because you can kind of have a different view when you're zoomed out at the entire picture, and then when you zoom into one thing, you could change the pitch, or you can really customize it and toggle layers. So that's flyTo and fitBounds, gives you a little control over the camera. Okay, so next I want to move on to creating a hover effect, and let me see. Sorry, I'm going to pause for a quick second. I see a question in the chat from Sophia. Thank you for this. Could the script be shared at the end? I'll definitely share the script. I probably won't do it as part of the webinar, but right afterwards I will, and I will make sure that it ends up in the YouTube video where this will end up in the description. It'll go in there. If you can't find it for whatever reason, jump into our Discord and give me a yell, and I'll be happy to point you to it. Okay, so next we want to show and hide layers. I'm sorry, we're going to do highlighting. So I'm going to lean on our examples again, and we actually have a great example for the hover effect. And this is using 50 states, but it's actually some really good talking points and some really good teaching moments I can show here when we adapt this example to a different set of data, which we already have on our project. But very simply, I want to talk through this notion of feature state. So when we do add layer, so we showed this in the last session, when we add a layer to the map, we can add an expression to dynamically set some of these paint properties. So in here, we're actually adding an expression that says, depend on feature state. Feature state is not it's not hard-coded into the data that we import into that layer, but it's something we have control over once it's actually in our project. So what this expression is saying here is to set the fill opacity based on a case. And it's saying the case will be a Boolean, so it's true or false. And we have a new feature state value called hover, and we can name feature state values whatever we want. But hover is one that we can name, and it's going to be a true or false. And basically it's saying if hover is true, the fill opacity should be 1. And if it's false, the fill opacity should be 0.5. So all this does is define the styling based on feature state. So if we were to copy this right now, nothing would change because feature state would always be false because we haven't actually defined it. So this is kind of a two-part process where we need to add some styling to our layer to determine how it's going to be displayed based on the feature state. Then we need to add some more code later to actually toggle that feature state. So you'll see how that works in a moment. But for now, I'm going to copy this fill opacity rule. So again, this is in the paint property when we do add layer. And if we go back to our code, you will see, if you remember, we added 2 layers. So we have borough boundaries fill, and then we have borough boundaries line. So I'm going to start with the fill layer because that's kind of, most of what you see on the map is filling in these boroughs. So all we have defined is fill color, which we did in the last session where we have an expression here that makes it dependent on the borough code. So I'm just going to add fill opacity. And just like in the example, it's going to say if the feature state is, if hover is true, set the opacity to 1. If not, it should be set to 0.5. So let's go look at the project now. Everything should be 0.5. So you can see it's very subtle, but you can actually see the base map or the layers underneath these polygons now, because feature state is always false. Or sorry, the feature state hover is always false. And I cannot, I can hover, but we haven't actually programmed it to do anything with that feature state. So right now, it's always false because, it hasn't ever been set to true. So let's go back to the example here. And we have a couple different listeners down here. So we have map.onMouseMove and map.onMouseLeave. So most of the action is happening here in this first one. And when we say map.onMouseMove, we're listening for any movement on the mouse, on the map, but we also add a second argument, which is a layer ID. And that's saying, don't just listen for movement on the entire map, listen only for movement on these, when the mouse is over a feature that's in this specific layer. So in this particular instance, it's called state fills, but of course we need to change this when we bring the code over. Before I copy and paste it, we'll go through a little bit more of the logic that's happening here. So we say e.features.length. So e would be the event that we get back after the mouse move happens. And if there are any features underneath, which there always will be because we're on a layer that is active, if there's any features underneath that, we'll get length here. And if it's saying if there are features underneath the mouse pointer when it moves, then we need to set the hovered state ID. We're going to say if the hovered state ID is not equal to null, then we're going to set feature state. So set feature state, these two chunks of code are where we actually set feature state. And we're basically just saying, if the hovered state ID, so the thing that is actively hovered, is not null, which means if something is already selected, set the feature state to false. Otherwise, we're going to set it to true. And then hovered state ID is actually going to equal the ID of the feature that we're hovering over. So it's a little complex, but you'll get the idea in a moment here. So I'm going to copy this over and then change a few values. So after we, let's see, before we do the click listener, let's do it right here. So we're going to say map.onMouseMove. So a few things we need to fix here. So the name of the layer that we want to listen for movement on is not state-fills. It is called borough-boundaries-fill, if you recall. And there's one reason why this won't work is because this part is actually saying e.features0.id basically means whatever features were underneath the mouse pointer when the mouse moved, get the ID of that feature, and that needs to be like a unique ID. So that's how they know. That's how we know which one is currently hovered. So this will be a problem because we actually don't have IDs in our data. So let's take a look here. If you remember, this is our GeoJSON data. So ID actually exists at the top level of a GeoJSON object. So we could add IDs here. And we could say, some unique ID as an ID. And that would give us the ability to know which feature somebody's talking about when they want to hover. So instead of actually doing this, there's actually a way to, when you create the data source in Mapbox.gl, you can actually use something called promote IDs. And that will actually say, you can actually take a property from the GeoJSON and actually promote it to that ID, and it'll set it for you. So let's take a quick look at that. And this should just start working. So when we say add source borough boundaries, I'm going to add another option here called promote ID. Let me double check and make sure it is promote ID and not promote IDs. Yes, promote ID. And then you pass in the property that you want to promote. So in here, it's called borough_code. I know that that is unique amongst each of my 5 features. So let's say borough_code. And I think if we get that done, this should just start working. Okay, hover state ID is not defined. Yes. So let's go back down here and take a look at what's happening on mouse move. So we're doing an if we basically want to check the current hover state ID. Basically, what is the ID that is currently hovered, or it should be null. The only reason this is not working is because this is not defined. So outside of this listener, I need to actually define it and say hovered. Let's do const, or no, let's do let hovered state ID equals null. So when we first load the map, none of the features will be hovered. So hovered state ID is null. And then basically what this code is going to do down here is once the mouse moves, this code will execute. It will pull the ID from whatever feature is under the mouse pointer, and then it will set the hover state, or will set the feature state so that the hover value is true. And then one last thing we actually need to do here is change the source. So there's no source called states, so we want to do borrow boundaries. And let's do borrow boundaries down here as well. Okay, let's try it. Look at that. Okay, so when I move the mouse, basically every time the mouse moves, it's checking to see which feature is under the mouse. And if it's different than the ID that we stored in this value hovered state ID, then it will basically, for example, if I move from the Bronx to Queens, as soon as that transition happens, it's checking if the hovered feature is different than the one it has in memory. If it is, it turns this one off, and then it turns this one on. So basically, that's what's happening with that chunk of code that we just looked at. And you can see this works pretty well, except when we leave, right? So there's nothing checking. It expects us to move from one to the other, and it will only unhighlight something when another feature is highlighted. So we need a little bit more code to actually handle this movement where I'm actually moving the mouse from a hovered feature to outside of this layer altogether, right? So works great when I'm moving between them, but as soon as I leave, this thing stays hovered. So the example covers that, and that's what this next listener is for. So you'll see we're listening for mouse leave on here, and then there's some simple logic that just says, if the hovered state is not equal to null, then we set feature state back to false. So it's basically clearing out the feature state. So resetting the hover value and feature state back to null for everything. So this should just work also if we copy and paste it. We just need to change the layer names. So let's do that. So we are listening for mouse leave on borrow boundaries fill. And we are listening for, sorry, the source where we want to actually update feature state is borrow boundaries. Okay, so let's try that out. Okay, so now when I leave and I don't go to a new feature, it actually unhighlights properly. So you can dig in a little bit more on this code, but works pretty well. And you can, this will scale up to whatever size of data you have and work pretty well. So that's how we do highlighting. Okay, next thing we want to cover is showing and hiding layers. So I'm going to add a couple more buttons here. And instead of actually having a button for showing and hiding, so I could have one button that says show and one button that says hide, I'm just going to have one button that actually says toggle. So we'll add some logic here that can actually check whether the layer is visible. If it's visible, then we'll hide it. If it's not visible, then we'll show it. So I'm going to add a button that just says toggle borrow boundaries. And let's give it an ID of toggle borrow, if I can spell it, boundaries. Okay, so our button is here, does nothing until we add a listener. So let's scroll all the way back down here and let's copy our click listeners and leave a new comment here that says toggle borrow boundaries. Okay, so the button we want to listen for is called toggle borrow boundaries. We're going to add an event listener for a click. And we're going to get rid of this fitBounds because that's not what we want to do. And the first thing I want to show is that we can actually do, say, map.get layout property. So get layout property is basically a way to reach into a layer and get a single property out of the configuration for that layer. You can also do get paint property. So if you remember, when we define our layer, we have paint and layout properties, and that defines, things like the fill and the opacity. So the full visibility of the layer is actually a layout property. So before I go further with this, I want to set a default value for the visibility of our borough boundaries fill. So borough boundaries fill, if you recall, has this paint object, and we never defined layout. So I can actually add layout, and there's lots of different layout properties. You can go check out the style spec, but there is one called visibility. So if I were to set visibility to the word none or the string none, and reload the map, you'll see the fill layer is no longer there. So it's still there conceptually and it's still ready to be shown, but it's basically just not rendering it because I set this value to none. So all I would then need to do is change this back to visible, and we'll be back in business. So that's how you can show and hide things, or at least that's how you can set their initial visibility. But now let's go back down to our event listener, and we can use get layout property and set layout property to actually change this. So the reason I did get layout property first is because I want to actually check to see whether this is visible. So I want to do is set up a variable, and I'll say const is visible. And I didn't spell it right, of course. So let's do is visible equals map.getLayout property. So get layout property, I can actually pass in a layer ID as a string, and then the property I want, which is visibility. Okay. So I need the name, I need the ID of my layer. And if we go back up here, you'll remember this is called borough boundaries fill. I should scroll back up to where we actually defined it. This is where we set the ID. So this layer is called borough boundaries fill. So I'll come right back down here and say, I want to get the visibility property of borough boundaries fill. So is visible. So if I left it this way, it would just set is visible would be equal to the word or to the string visible. So I'm actually going to set this to be an equality operator to say, so is visible will now be a Boolean. But it's basically checking to see if visibility is equal to visible, which would mean it is true. Okay, then I will add some code that says if is visible. So if the layer is visible, then I want to hide that layer. So how do I hide that layer? I just say map.set layout property. And same thing, the first two arguments will be the ID of the layer and then the property that I want to set. But I need to add a third argument, which will be what I want to set that value to, or set that property to. So if it is visible, I want to set the visibility to none. Else, if it's not visible, I want to make it visible. So I'll copy this entire chunk. And instead of setting it to none, we're going to set it to visible. So now my button will actually work for both, and it's basically doing a quick check at the beginning to see whether the layer is visible or not. And if it's visible, it shows it. And if it's not visible, it hides it. So let's try it out. And there we go. So each time I click this, it's showing and hiding the fill, but you'll notice we didn't actually do anything with the line layer. So to finish this up, we basically need to add the same thing. And I'm going to copy and paste both of these lines of code and just change out the properties, or change out the arguments. So borough boundaries line should also be hidden. Borough boundaries fill or borough boundaries line should also be shown whenever borough boundaries fill is shown. So there's our code, and let's give it a try. Okay, so now we have a nice way to toggle these. So the same thing would apply if you want to just show and hide layers based on zoom level. So you can, there's all kinds of different events you can listen for, whether it's from outside of the map or within the map, but there's you have the ability to have fine-grained control. You could also scale it and change the opacity, so you could make it so that these things like fade out or show up with less opacity at certain areas. So what you're interested in there is set layout property and get layout property, or set paint property and get paint property. So that's how we can control individual layers and individual properties of layers, actually. So here's our nice toggle button. Okay, wonderful. It's 1:11. So I'm going to try and move really quickly here, but we're going to add a search plugin. So I'm going to Google it again and just say Mapbox GL search. And there's a great example here called add a geocoder. And again, we're not going to go too deep on this, but I just want to show that, once you have your map working, it's super easy to add a geocoder with just a couple lines of code. And if you look down in this example, you'll see, this should look familiar to you. This is how we instantiate the map. But once we get down here, there's some code for adding a control, and it says new Mapbox GL geocoder, and you pass in an access token, which you already have loaded, and then you pass in a Mapbox GL instance, or Mapbox GL, pass in Mapbox GL, which is the library we're using for the map. So that's really all we have to do. Other than that, we have to make sure that we're loading Mapbox GL geocoder and its CSS, which is what these script tags do. So I'm actually just going to copy these. But right after we instantiate the map, let's go here and paste that in. So this would break because it would say Mapbox geocoder doesn't exist right now. So the next thing we need to do is add the script tag and the link tag. So that brings in the actual geocoder JavaScript and its CSS. So I'll paste that in. So it's worth noting that this is going to be deprecated soon, and there's actually a new replacement for it called Mapbox Search.js, which should work with vanilla JavaScript or React, depending on which environment you want, but it has a few more options and is more actively developed. But this is tried and true and still works. Mapbox GL geocoder is what we're showing here. So yeah, all it took was copying that code over to instantiate the geocoder. You can actually send this little geocoder widget into either corner of the map you want, so it doesn't have to be in the top right. But for example, if I search for Empire State Building, you can see you have search results. It shows 5 by default, but you can actually make this list longer. And if I click on it, it'll actually zoom the map in on my behalf and show me a nice marker. As soon as I click this little X to clear it, the marker will disappear. So this is highly extensible. You can do lots of great things with it. But let me really quickly show you. Let me see if there's a link to it. Yeah, if we go to Mapbox GL geocoder, there's really no website for this plugin. It's just a GitHub repository. And in here, you'll find the docs. So if you scroll down, you can see there's an api.md has the full API reference. And I'll just give you a quick peek at some of the things you can do here. But yeah, we pass in a parameters object. So you can see in our code that all we did was pass in, where is it? All we did was pass in, sorry, let me go find it now. Yeah, all we did was pass in the access token and Mapbox GL, which are the bare minimum to use it. But you can also set things like flyTo, which will control how it moves when it, actually it's a Boolean. Oh, it's a Boolean or an object. So you could just tell it to not, like people can search and you can actually take that search result and do something with it, but you don't have to make the map move to it. So there's lots of control you can have there. So there's a few different things you can check out, but I would go take a look at this list of options and see what you can do. But if you just want bare bones search, we already have it. It's here. So I can search for Battery Park City. You can also control where to give results near. So you can actually, say it should be near what the current map view is, or it can be near some other, point. So you can pass in a lat long that you want it to give you results that are near or within a certain geometry or geography or that sort of thing. So go check it out, but that gives you the full power of Mapbox search with just a few lines of code. Okay, 1:15, run out of time. Very quickly, I want to show Mapbox Studio. We're going to have a whole other getting started webinar on Mapbox Studio, but it is a resource. Once you have your map up and running, you can come here and actually do a lot more customization. So I'm going to go to studio.mapbox.com. We're going to do a very quick demo here. So what you should be familiar with is there are styles, tile sets, and data sets. These are three concepts you need to be aware of. I'm going to get it. If you want to know about tile sets and bring in your own custom data, we cover that in the other webinar that we're going to do in the future, probably in January, on getting started with Mapbox Studio. For now, we're going to look at Studio simply as a way to modify these Mapbox core style base maps to our liking. So I'm going to click on New Style here, and it's going to say choose a template. So let's make this a little bigger because we don't need to see the code right now. So these should look familiar to you, but there's the outdoor theme, there's a satellite streets theme. If you click monochrome, you'll see light and dark. So I've been using the dark theme. So for example, if I want to choose dark, I can now customize it. And this is the Studio interface where we have really tight control over the layers. So if you remember last class or last webinar, we inspected the layers and we saw that, the water is a layer, the labels are a layer, the small streets and the big streets are layers. So the simplest thing I like to illustrate in here is that we can go have control over these. So like these were expertly designed by cartographers that work, here at Mapbox. But what you can do is change whatever you want. So you can say, I want this dark style, but I want it with no labels. So what I can do is actually come in here and click on layers, and here's all the layers. At least they're in groups actually. But if I wanted to just turn off labels, I can click on them and just start toggling this little eyeball. And let's see if we can get these. Yeah, so they're starting to disappear. And that's not all of them, that's some of them, that's the place labels, but we also have point of interest labels. So let's click that one and turn that off. So you can see the points of interest disappeared. How do I get rid of the streets? Road labels, so let's click those. So now those are hidden. So now I just have like a very generic base map, still has this Manhattan label. I'm not sure which layer that's coming from, but you get the idea. The other cool thing you can do, other than just hiding and showing things, is change their style. So behind the scenes, all of this is the same styling language that we were using in our code. But if we click on, for example, water, we can, so water has waterways and water areas. And if we click this little override button, we can actually change the water to whatever color we want. So if I wanted blood red seas in my map, or if I wanted them to be, blue because water is blue, it all depends on what you're going for. But you can take these existing styles and just change one or two things about them and really make them match either your brand or whatever design aesthetic you're going for in your map, which is pretty fun. You can also do this in the client, but here it's a little easier because you have this great user interface. So all this stuff, you could do in code, but this makes it easier to just tinker with the way you would, using Photoshop or Illustrator or Figma. So this is a very simple change, but this is now a custom base map that I've created. And if I actually click on publish, so let's publish this. This is now my creation. It's based on the Mapbox dark theme or dark style. But it's dark with no label, or with most labels missing, and blue water. Cool. If I click share, I'll actually get a style URL, and this should look familiar to you, but it's basically the same format that we used when we instantiated the map on our project. But instead of using one of the Mapbox core styles, we're using this one that comes from my personal Mapbox account, and you can do the same. So let's copy that, bring it back over to our project, and instead of using the official Mapbox dark V10 theme or core style, I want to use this custom style that I just made and published. And let's see if this will work. And this should make our project have blue water. There it is. Okay, so why did my borough boundaries not work anymore? Road label does not exist on this map. Oh, very interesting. Because when I added when I called add layer for my borough boundaries, I actually told it to put my borough boundaries underneath the road layers, the road label layer. And because I disabled that in Studio, it doesn't exist. So I'm going to get rid of this before variable, and we won't see the error anymore. And now we've got custom base style with my custom interactivity. I can turn off my toggle. I can toggle my borough boundaries. I can fly to Queen. I can fit to Queens. I can fly to Coney Island, and I can reset the view. And that is all we've got to cover. So in the last few minutes, if anyone has a question, go ahead and throw it into chat, and I would be happy to answer that question. So take a moment now if you have anything to ask. And let me bring up some slides again. When I make that full screen, I can't see the chat anymore. So I will leave it not full screen and just say, let me know if you have any questions. All right, questions going once, questions going twice. Like I said, you can find me in the Mapbox developer Discord if you want to ask questions about this and have a little more dialogue that's not, part of the webinar and won't be recorded. But that's up to you. So before we go, let me share this. So our next installment. So we're moving away from Mapbox GL. So we now got 3 episodes on getting started with Mapbox GL. And next week, we're going to start with getting started with the Maps SDK for iOS. So this will be great. It should be a 2-part series, but it will cover mostly the same types of content, like get your map loaded, custom interactivity, control the camera, add layers, add your own data, that sort of thing. So tune in next week for the same time for the first installment of getting started with the Maps SDK for iOS. And then I'll leave you with, is there a chat? Thanks again. Is there a way? Oh, we do have a question. Okay, before we go. Is there a way to fly to one point on the next one with just the one button, like a point route? Oh, for sure. I mean, it all just comes down to programming it in JavaScript. So what I would probably do to attack that is have like a list of stops that I would store in like an array, or maybe an array of objects. So inside of each object, I might have a center point and a zoom level that I want to fly to. And then, I would increment a counter maybe. And when I click on the button, take my counter variable from 0 to 1, then from 1 to 2, etc. So each time I'd increment it, you could just say, choose the object from that array of objects and then fly to whatever that object says. So again, that's not functionality built into Mapbox GL. It's just something you would have to code up on your own inside in your JavaScript environment. Any more questions before we go? Going once, going twice. I'm not going to say going 3 times, because if you fire it off now, I will answer it. But if not, jump into the developer Discord. So here's our resources slide. But again, check out the documentation, check out the awesome list of demos, geojson.io, still very helpful. And yeah, I think that'll close it for today. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you at the next one. I will not be presenting the Maps SDK for iOS work, but I will be hosting. So we'll have another developer engineer at Mapbox actually showing that off. So we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much.